Hello everyone, my name is Mark Anderson Audio, and today we're going to be talking about Foley and sound design. So one of the main freelance jobs that I get is to do sound design and sound effects for games, and I send them all across the world. I tend to work remotely from here, and then I email them out to people across the world. So we're going to talk about some of the things that I've discovered and, for the most part, learned the hard way, and share some of that tips and advice with you. So let's get started. So the first thing that you cannot ignore with sound design is noise. Noise is your enemy. It is absolutely everywhere, and it's until you do sound design and try and record very quiet, intricate things, like, for example, say footsteps or the sound of some cutlery clanging together, you don't realize just how prevalent noise is everywhere. If you're used to recording music, you can get away with a lot of noise, because once you, say, if you've got a noisy vocalist who's shuffling around a lot when they're singing, once you throw in all your other instruments, your drums, your loud guitars and whatnot, the noise just gets masked, it gets covered up and you don't hear it. But in sound design, it's very important to be able to learn to identify sources of noise, and because it can just be a huge problem. So stuff like clocks, refrigerators, heating systems, cars, miles and miles and miles in the distance can even be a problem. And wind as well. It can really ruin a recording, especially if you're trying to record something that's very quiet. So the first bit of advice there is to always try and have good closed back headphones on while you're recording and you're monitoring. Closed back will kind of, you can stick them on your head and they will remove some of the sound from around you. They'll blank out some of that noise so that you can really focus on what your microphone is picking up, which is the important part. Because even if you can't hear or perceive noise, your microphone might actually be picking it up and then amplifying it a lot. So if you've got good headphones on, good sturdy headphones, you'll hopefully be able to identify that noise before it becomes a problem. Windshields are an absolute must, especially if you're going outside at all, but they are not perfect, and don't expect them to do magical things. So a windshield will kind of deflect a lot of the noise of wind and stop it rustling your microphone. If you've ever been outside with a mic and not had a windshield, you'll know that sound, that kind of horrible rumbling noise that completely ruins takes. You need a windshield to stop that, but if it's a friggin' tornado, you can't just stick a windshield on and assume you're going to be fine. You need to get kind of clever and creative with it. Like for a lot, if I'm recording, even if I'm just recording wind, I try not to just stand outside. I'll maybe stand kind of next to a window that's ever so slightly open, and then I'll put my microphone near the gap of that window. Or if I'm out in the wilderness, I'll try and stand behind a tree or behind a bush, so that the wind itself isn't directly hitting my mic, but it's just rushing around me. So I'm recording the sound around me rather than having the sound to try and crunch its way into my microphone, for lack of a better term. So you need windshields, but they're not miracle workers. The normalized test. So the normalized test is something I came up with after I had a problem. So I did some work for a client once. I made lots of sound effects, and they were all quite low volume, even when I was kind of adding effects to them and processing them and all that sort of stuff. But I didn't really mind. I was just like, it's cool, I'll normalize them at the end, and then I can send them all to my client, and then I'll be fine. But what I discovered is when I normalized those files after I'd finished processing them, is there was actually a lot of noise hidden within them that I didn't realize was there. And at that point, I'd already spent several days processing these files and editing them and doing all sorts of clever, intricate stuff with them. And at that point, I was like, oh no, now I have a folder filled with sound effects that I can't send away. I can't send these to my client. They're too noisy. So the normalized test is to normalize stuff the moment you get it off your recorder, or the moment you stick your mic in front of something. The first opportunity you have to normalize something, try doing it, because if there's any noise in there, the process of normalizing it will identify it for you. So you can say, well, this one has too much noise, I'll scrap this one. I'm not going to waste any more time editing this one. Or if this one's got a little bit of noise, right, we'll deal with that noise now, and then try and work with the file later. So this is more of a preventative sort of measure that again is from experience for me. Normalize things first. You can potentially stop a lot of heartache later, and you won't waste time working on files that are unrecoverable, for lack of a better term. Finally, edit in a quiet place. Again, if you're used to working with music, you can get away with working in a not particularly quiet environment when you're, say, mixing or editing, for example. Because the pure volume of the music will drown out the noise. But when it comes to to sound effect design, if you're again editing very quiet, very delicate sounds, you need to be able to hear every little microcosm of noise that's in those audio files. And if you've got like an extractor fan or something in the next room that you can sort of hear buzzing through, you might not actually be able to tell that there's any noise on that file. So edit in the most quiet place you possibly can. Okay, so next we're going to talk about pitch shifting and sampling rates. So pitch shifting for me is the most fundamental sound design technique. I pitch shift the living hell out of absolutely everything. I use samplers, so I can just throw a sound effect onto my sampler and then have my MIDI keyboard in front of me and play the notes, and it'll basically pitch shift those things for me. Like, so I can pitch shift things down a few octaves up over there, or a few octaves up over there, to really change the sound of something and get kind of quite creative with stuff. So the reason I do this is pitch is related to size. So if you think about high-pitched sound, they are perceived as being small in size. So if you think of a mouse that's squeaking, that is a very high-pitched sound, and it comes from a very small animal. Whereas if you've got a low-pitched sound, they're perceived as being very large. So if you've got like a gorilla or an elephant or something much deeper sounding voices, roars, whatever you want to call them. So pitch is related to size. And the reason this is important is because when we're doing sound design, we very rarely get asked to do very normal, easy stuff. So I used to work at a university, and some of my students there, they were tasked with doing some sound of creating the sound of a submarine. And I don't know about you guys, but we don't really have submarines lying around that we can stick microphones in front of. So what they did is they basically got a metal bin and basically kind of shook it and kicked it and banged it around a bit, and then pitch shifted it down about 5 or 6 octaves, absolutely loads, to create this huge kind of ethereal soundscapey kind of vibe out of it. And it just sounded absolutely massive. And when they synced up the audio with the image of a submarine, it kind of sounded like a submarine. So pitch is the kind of fundamental way that we get around the problems that as sound designers we have to deal with. As I say, we don't have access to everything in the world. That would be too easy. Instead, we have to get creative, and pitch shifting is the easiest way to do that. By manipulating the pitch of something, we can change the perceived size of the outcome. Cool. It's also worth noting that pitch shifting sounds much better at higher sampling rates. So you've probably done some pitch shifting at some point in the past and noticed it gets quite grainy, especially if you're pitching down the way. It gets kind of grainy and granular, and it doesn't sound very pleasant. The higher your sampling rate is, the more extreme your pitch shifting can be before you start to get that kind of granular effects come in. So most people work at 44.1 kilohertz, which is the kind of standard CD Red Book sampling rate. And that's fine for most musical applications, really. But for sound design, I always try and record is at the highest sampling rate that I can reasonably work in. So if you have access to 192 kilohertz sampling rates as part of your setup, then feel free to use it, and you can then pitch shift up and down to your heart's content and in very extreme ways without that horrible granular sound coming in. For me, I tend to use 96 kilohertz because for my Pro Tools system, if I go any higher sampling rate than that, I tend to run into sort of crashes and problems and CPU errors and stuff. So I try and stick to about 96 kilohertz. It's also worth noting that you should try and maintain the highest possible sampling rate as long as you can. And what I mean by that is if you've got your portable recorder, you're out in the field, you're recording at 96 kilohertz, whatever, and then you go home to your Pro Tools, your Logic, whatever you're using, and then create a session that runs at 44.1 kilohertz, it's going to downsample your audio file to 44.1 kilohertz. And you're going to lose all that lovely fidelity that you spent time recording with in the first place. So always double check what your session is running at to make sure you're again maintaining the highest possible sampling rate you can until you're eventually bouncing out a file to send to a client or to work on your project, in which case you can set it out at 44.1 or whatever you want it to be. Okay, so knowing what to record. So again, I'm going to go back to this example of we need to record the sound of a submarine kind of thing. One of the things about sound design is when you first start to get into it, it's hard to get into the mindset of a sound designer. Again, because we don't have access to every physical object in humanity in in our back rooms. You know, we need to be creative. So when I get asked to record something that's quite challenging or is going to be quite awkward to do, the first thing I do is think about what the material of that object is. So for example, that submarine is made of metal. So what I do is I grab my microphone, put some headphones on, and I walk around into my house about all the things that I can find that are metal. Preferably quite large stuff, things like kind of radiators or my refrigerator or anything like shower rails, whatever, and start hitting those things with my hand, with other objects, and starting making recordings that way. And then I try pitch shifting things up and down to see what kind of perceived size and kind of timbres I can come up with. So a good example of this is a few years ago, I was asked to make the sound of a kind of ancient war era catapult thing. And again, don't have one of those lying around, but I was thinking to myself, well, what do they have? You know, they're probably very kind of wooden sort of vehicle sort of structures, probably kind of loosely kind of bound together with rope, probably quite shaky and quite kind of rattly. So I had a bookshelf that basically what I did is I found a bunch of random objects and I put them on the bookshelf, and then I started to shake that bookshelf, and all those little objects on it would kind of shake around and make lots of extra noise and stuff as well. And I recorded that and then pitch shifted it down a bit, and there I had it. I had what I was looking for. So that's a good place to start, is to think about the material of the item in question, as it were, and then kind of work from that. Cool. So does the sound have multiple parts or stages? So if you've ever seen quite like a low budget kind of film or TV show, or maybe a low budget game, and the sound effects have seemed a bit weak, one of the main reasons for this is that in reality, sounds have usually several stages and several transitionary stages. So the easiest example to give of this is an explosion. So an explosion doesn't just go bang and that's it. What you'll get is you'll get a bang, you'll get the sound of all the shrapnel hitting other objects that are close to it. So it might be kind of stones hitting metal, stones hitting other stones, whatever. And then a few seconds later, you'll get the kind of shh of all the dust kind of flowing down. And you'll also get this kind of overlying, really deep low-end boom that maybe lasts a few seconds as it's like the sound emanates throughout the landscape sort of thing. Another example of this is if you've got like a gun. If you're shooting a gun, it doesn't just go and shoot. You might have the sound of the trigger clicking or the bolt mechanism of the gun kind of clacking in and out. What is the bullet hitting? Is it hitting wood? Is it hitting stone? How far away is that target? Because that'll make a difference to how quick it will be before the impact sound of the material, for example. So always try and think about the different stages and different transitionary stages of a sound, and try and cater for those to make your sound seem a bit more lively. Okay, so the next bit's the really boring bit: file management and organization. I bring this up because, again, this is a real problem thing. Especially in sound design, you will have a million sound effects at some point, and keeping track of them all can be really, really difficult. One of the most difficult things to do is actually file naming and file naming conventions. Especially if you're making, say, loads of different sounds of people swinging swords or shooting lasers and shooting guns and explosions and a million different types of weapons, it can be hard to kind of name them all. So I don't necessarily have a specific technique, as it were, but just always be aware of what you're calling something. Like, is it kind of laser gun 1, laser gun 2? Is it small laser gun, big laser gun? What I ended up doing at some points is I was being asked to make some sounds for an anime game with lots of kind of very dramatic sounding effects. And I was struggling to come up with names for them. So what I literally did is actually named them phonetically. So I had a sound that was like shing. So I literally spell out shing phonetically, so that when I look at that file, I can tell what it is just by looking at it. And it might not sound like much, but when you've got thousands and thousands of files and sound effects, being able to do a quick search for like kind of something that says shing and have it come up is a big deal. It makes things much easier. So another technique that I've used as well is I save kind of Pro Tools projects, or Reason is the other bit of software I use, really. Reason and Pro Tools projects when I've created a specific type of sound. So maybe I've done some sort of clever synthesis thing or whatever, some sort of intricate process, and I want to save that in case I need to come back to it. Because I might like the sound, but I might send it to a client and they say, it's kind of okay, but could you maybe make this one do a little bit more of that or a little bit less of this, whatever. And at that point, you have two options. You either take that kind of raw audio file that you sent them and then try and manipulate that a little bit to get what the client's looking for. Or if you've saved your kind of editing process as its own project file, you can then go back in and edit it much more specifically, which is great. And it's saved my bacon a couple of times. What it is worth noting, though, is you can very quickly take up absolutely tons of hard disk space with a million folders doing stuff using this technique. So about once a month, I go back through and I clean out all the ones and delete all the ones that I don't need anymore. Once the client's satisfied with the sound that they have, I go delete that project file. Otherwise, I'd have a million and never, ever be able to find anything. Something else I've been using recently is OneDrive, which is it's like Dropbox, Google Drive, the cloud storage stuff. I have a folder on there that has every one of my sound effects that I've ever created, and I just dump them all in there. This has been a total revelation to my workflow, because I work on this computer, I've got another computer in my studio, and then I've got a laptop that I work on occasionally too. And having all those kind of synced up via cloud storage has been brilliant. It means that whenever I create a new sound, I just throw it on my OneDrive, and it will appear at that other studio. So when I need it, I can get it, and I don't have to worry about it. It's worth noting it can take ages when you first set this up, because you have to upload all those files for the first time. And most internet connections have quite quick download speeds, but really slow upload speeds. So it took a couple of days of just leaving my computer on, just letting it upload stuff for ages before it kind of finally worked. But now whenever I create new sounds, I'm only ever creating, 10, 20, 30 at a time. And I can throw them in that folder and it'll just upload those few. So it's a hassle when you first set it up, but fantastic once it gets going. Okay, so audio formats and compression. So what format does your client require? The reason I say this is because in the past, due to my ignorance, what I used to just do is have a folder of 44.1 kilohertz, 24-bit audio files, and I would just send them all via FTP to my client, which would not only take ages to send all that uncompressed audio, but they needed to actually then compress it on their side again later. So it was a waste of their time, which kind of makes me look bad. So now what I tend to do is have uncompressed audio kind of in a backup folder on my computer, and I send them the compressed audio. So I find out what they use. For me, it's always been either MP3 or Ogg Vorbis is what my clients have required. And then I'll compress and send that to them. So it's worth noting that most compression stuff starts with the removal of high frequencies. So if you've got any sounds that are very, very reliant on high frequency content to get the right timbre and right effect across, it's maybe worth noting that those should have less severe compression applied to them. Otherwise, the sound quality is going to degrade much quicker on those. And conversely, if you've got a sound that's predominantly low frequency, you can actually get away with quite severe compression on those before the perceived audio quality starts to deteriorate. This can be important for people who make games especially, because they want everything to be as small as possible. They want the file sizes to be absolutely as small as possible. So you need to get that balance of creating the file size as small as possible, but with as little perceived degradation in audio quality as possible. So you might want to go through your sounds and say, I want to apply quite severe compression to these ones, or a very light compression to these ones and whatnot. And again, your client will likely appreciate that you've gone to the hard work of doing that as well, so they don't have to later on. If you need something to compress stuff, I recommend Lame XP. It is a free kind of audio converter and compressor bit of software. There's the link there, lamexp.sourceforge.net. It's not the nicest and prettiest bit of software, but it does exactly what you need it to do. You can select all the different types of audio compression that you're ever realistically going to need, and you can choose the bit rate for them as well, so it's very useful. And you can do batch compression, so if you need to convert 20 files at a time, you can do that. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. I know I rambled a little bit, but that's just me. If you've got your own kind of sound design and Foley tips, please share them in the comments section below, rather. I'm hoping to do more kind of sound effect and kind of Foley design videos. I'm hoping to start something called Sound Effects School, where I take very specific sound effects and try and kind of recreate them, and then take you guys through the step-by-step process of creating that sound to create the finished product. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. My name is Mark Anderson Audio. Adios.